The human organism. In later life for the human race, and in its cultures, development potential is effected with the help of the inner circle. From this point of view, all evolution possible to mankind consists of the evolution of a small number of individuals, spread possibly over a long period of time. The mass of humanity itself does not evolve. It merely varies a little, adapting itself to changes in surrounding conditions. Mankind, like an organism, evolves by the evolution of a certain very small number of cells of which it consists. The evolving cells pass as it were into the higher tissues of the organism, and these higher tissues receive nourishment by absorbing the evolving cells. The idea of higher tissues is the idea of the inner circle. As previously mentioned, the idea of an inner circle contradicts all recognized sociological theories concerning the structure of human society. However, this idea brings us to other theories long forgotten which did not receive due attention in their time. Hence, from time to time, there arose in sociology the question as to whether humanity could be regarded as an organism, and human communities as smaller organisms. That is, can a biological view of social phenomena be possible? Contemporary sociological thought adopts a negative attitude in relation to this idea, and it has long been considered unscientific to regard a community as an organism. The mistake lies, however, in the way the problem itself is formulated. The concept organism is taken in too narrow a sense and only in one preconceived idea. Namely, if a human community, nation, people or race is taken as an organism, it is regarded as an organism either analogous to the human organism, or higher than the human organism. The idea, however, can be correct only in relation to the whole of mankind. Separate human groups, no matter how large they may be, can never be analogous to man, and still less they can never be superior to him. Biology knows of and has established the existence of entirely different orders of organism. If, in examining the phenomena of social life, we bear in mind the difference between organisms on different rungs of the biological ladder, the biological view of social phenomena then becomes more possible. But this only on condition that we realize every human community, such as a race or a tribe, is a lower organism when compared to individual man. A race or nation regarded as an organism has nothing in common with the highly developed and complex organism of individual man, which for every function has a special organ and a great capacity for adaptation, possesses free movement and so on. In comparison with individual man, a race or nation as an organism stands on a very low level, that of animal plants. These organisms are amorphous, for the most part immobile, masses or beings that have no special organs for any of their functions, and do not possess the capacity for free movement, being fixed to a definite place or locality. They put out something like feelers in different directions, and by means of these seize other beings like themselves and ingest them. The whole life of these organisms consists of their eating one another. There are some organisms which possess the capacity for absorbing a quantity of smaller organisms and temporarily become very large and strong. Then two of these large organisms meet one another and a struggle begins between them in which either one or both are destroyed, possibly weakened. The whole external history of humanity, the history of the struggles between peoples and races, consists of nothing but the process which has just been described of animal plants eating one another. In the midst of all this, underneath it all, proceeds the life and activity of individual man, that is of the individual cells of these organisms. The activity of these individual men produces what we call culture or civilization. The activity of the masses is hostile to this culture, they always destroy it. Peoples create nothing. They only destroy, it is individuals who create. All inventions, discoveries, improvements, all technical progress, the progress of science, art, architecture and engineering, all philosophical systems, all religious teachings, all these are results of the activity of individuals. The destruction of the results of this activity, their distortion, annihilation, obliteration from the face of the earth, this is the activity of human masses. This does not mean that individual men do not serve destruction. On the contrary, the initiative of destruction on a large scale always belongs to individuals, and the masses are merely the executive agency. The masses can never create anything, although they can destroy on their own accord. If we understand that the masses of humanity, that is, peoples and races, are lower beings as compared to individual man, then we can understand that peoples and races cannot evolve in the same measure as individuals. We have no idea of the evolution possible for a people or a race, although we often speak of such an evolution. In reality, all peoples and nations within the limits of our historical observation follow one and the same course. They grow, they develop, reach a certain degree of size and power, then begin to be divided up, decline and fall, until finally they disappear entirely and become components or parts of some other being like themselves. Races and nations die in the same way as individual man. But individuals have certain other possibilities besides death, which the great organism of the human masses have not. For the souls of these are as amorphous as their bodies. The tragedy of individual man lies in the fact that he lives, as it were, within the dense mass of such a lower being, and so all his activity is in the service of the purely vegetable functions of this blind jelly-like organism. At the same time, the conscious individual activity of man, his efforts in the domain of thought and creative work, run contrary to these big organisms, in spite of them and in defiance of them. But of course it would not be true to say that all the individual activity of man consists of a conscious struggle against these big organisms. Man is conquered and made a slave. It often happens that man thinks he is serving and must serve these big beings by his individual activity. However, the higher manifestations of the human spirit, the higher activities of man, are entirely unnecessary to the big organisms. In most cases they are actually unpleasant to them, hostile and even dangerous, since they divert to individual work, forces that might otherwise have been absorbed into the vortex of the life of the big organism. In an unconscious, merely physiological way, the big organism endeavors to appropriate all the powers of the individual cells that are its components, using them in its own interests, that is to say, mainly for fighting other similar organisms. When we remember that individual cells, that is, men, are far more highly organized beings than big organisms, and that the activities of the former go far beyond the activities possible for the latter, then we understand this perpetual conflict between men and the human aggregates. We understand that what is called progress or evolution is that which is left over of individual activities after the struggle between the amorphous masses and this individual activity has taken place. The blind organisms of the masses struggle with the manifestation of the evolutionary spirit, annihilate and stifle it, destroying what has been created by it. However, in spite of this, they cannot entirely annihilate it. Something remains, and this is what we call progress or civilization. The idea of evolution in the lives of individual man and human communities, the idea of esotericism, the birth and growth of cultures and civilizations, the possibilities of individual man connected with periods of rise and fall, all these and many other things are expressed in three biblical myths. These three myths are not connected in the Bible and stand separately, but in reality they express one and the same idea, mutually completing one another. The first myth is the story of the Great Flood and of Noah's Ark. The second is the story of the Tower of Babel, of its destruction, and of the confusion of tongues. The third is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Abraham's vision and of the 10 righteous men, for whose sake God agreed to spare Sodom and Gomorrah, but who could not be found there. The Great Flood is an allegory of the fall of civilization, of the destruction of culture. Such a fall must be accompanied by the annihilation of the greater part of the human race, as a consequence of geological upheavals, or of wars, of the migration of masses, epidemics, revolutions, and similar causes. Very often all these causes coincide. The idea of the allegory is that at the moment of the apparent destruction of everything, that which is truly valuable is saved according to a plan previously prepared and thought out. A small group of men escapes from the general law and saves all the most important ideas and attainments of the given culture. The legend of Noah's Ark is a myth referring to esotericism. The building of the ark is the school, the preparation of men for initiation, the transition to a new life, for new birth. Noah's Ark, which is saved from the flood, is the inner circle of humanity. The second meaning of the allegory refers to individual man. The flood is death, unavoidable, inexorable, but man can build within himself an ark and assemble in it specimens of everything that is valuable to him. In such a case these specimens will not perish. They will survive death and be born again. Just as mankind can be saved only through the connection with the inner circle, so an individual man can attain personal salvation only by means of a link with the inner circle in himself, that is, by connecting himself with higher forms of consciousness. This cannot, however, be done without outside help, without assistance from the inner circle. The second myth, that of the Tower of Babel, is another version of the first, but the first speaks of salvation, of those who are saved, whereas the second speaks only of ruin and of those who shall perish. The Tower of Babel represents culture. Men dream of building a tower of stone, whose top may reach onto heaven, of creating an ideal life on earth. They believe in intellectual methods, in technical means, in formal institutions that are founded upon logos, on logic. For a long time the tower rises higher and higher above the earth. But the moment infallibly arrives when men cease to understand each other, or rather, realize that they have never done so. Each of them understands in his own way the ideal life on earth. Each of them wants to carry out his own ideas. Each of them wants to fulfill his own ideal. This is the moment when the confusion of tongues begins. Men cease to understand one another even in the simplest things. Lack of understanding provokes discord, hostility and struggle. The men who built the tower start killing one another and destroying what they have built. The tower falls in ruins. Precisely the same thing occurs in the life of the whole of humanity, in the life of peoples and nations, in the life of individual man. Each man builds a Tower of Babel in his own life. His strivings, his aims for life, his attainments, these are his Tower of Babel. But the moment is inevitable when the tower will fall. A slight shock, an unfortunate accident, an illness, a small miscalculation, and of his tower nothing remains. Man sees it, but it is already too late to correct or alter things. Or a moment may come in the building of the tower when the different eyes of a man's personalities lose confidence in one another, see all the contradictions of their aims and desires, see that they have no common aim. Cease to understand one another, or more exactly cease to think that they understand. Then the tower must fall, the illusory aim must disappear, and the man must feel that everything that he has done was fruitless, that it has led to nothing and could lead to nothing, and that there is only one real fact, death. The whole life of man, the accumulation of riches, power, or learning is the building of a Tower of Babel, because it must end in catastrophe, in death, which is the fate of everything that cannot pass to a new plane of being. The third myth, that of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, shows still more clearly than the first two, the intervention of higher forces and the cause of this interference. God agreed to spare Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of 50 righteous men, for the sake of 45, for the sake of 30, for the sake of 20, at last for the sake of 10. But 10 righteous men could not be found, and the 2 cities were destroyed. The possibility of evolution had been lost. The great laboratory ceased the unsuccessful experiment. But Lot and his family were saved. The idea is the same as the other 2 myths, but in particular emphasizes the readiness of the guiding will to make all possible concessions as long as there is any hope of the realization of the aim set for human beings. When this hope disappears, the guiding will must inevitably interfere to save what deserves salvation, then destroy the rest. The expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, the fall of the Tower of Babel, the Great Flood, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah are all legends and allegories relating to the history of mankind, to human evolution. Besides these legends and many others similar to them, almost all races have legends, tales, and myths of strange non-human beings, who passed along the same road before man. The fall of the angels, of titans, of Hindu gods who attempted to defy other more powerful gods, the fall of Lucifer, the demon or Satan are all falls which precede the fall of man. The meaning of all these myths is hidden. The usual theological and theosophical interpretations explain little, because they introduce the necessity of recognizing the existence of invisible races or spirits, which at the same time are similar to man in their relation to higher forces. The inadequacy of such an explanation, by introducing 5 new unknown quantities for the definition of one unknown quantity is evident. But at the same time it would be wrong to leave all these myths without any attempt at explanation, because by their very persistency and repetition among different peoples and races, they seem to draw our attention to certain phenomena that we do not know, but which we should know. The legends and epics of all countries contain much material relating to non-human beings who preceded man or even existed at the same time as man, but differed from man in many ways. This material is so abundant and significant that not to make an attempt to explain these myths would mean shutting our eyes intentionally to something we ought to see. Such, for example, are the legends of giants and the so-called cyclopean structures that one involuntarily associates with these legends. Unless we wish to ignore many facts, or believe in three-dimensional spirits capable of building stone edifices, we must suppose that pre-human races were as physical as man and came just as man did, from the great laboratory of nature. That nature had made attempts at creating self-evolving beings before mankind. Further, we must suppose that such beings were let out of the great laboratory into life, but that they failed to satisfy nature in their further development, and instead of carrying out nature's designs, turned against her. Then nature abandoned experimentation with them and began a new experiment. Strictly speaking, we have no grounds for considering man as the first or the only experiment of a self-evolving being. On the contrary, the myths mentioned previously, such as the Vedic tales, or legends of Asgard, give us the possibility of presuming the existence of such beings before men. If this is so, if we have grounds for supposing the existence of physical races of pre-human, self-evolving beings, where then should we look for the descendants of these races, and are we in any way justified in supposing the existence of such descendants,